both at home and in person. Thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a very interesting talk. I'm proud to welcome Ilana van Wyk, one of our very own from the Anthropology department. And just to give a bit of background, she has quite vast teaching experience. So she taught at London School of Economics and Political Science, at the School of Oriental and African Studies, at the University of Pretoria, and at the University of Cape Town. Ilana has published widely on Pentecostal Charismatic Christianity and gambling, and is the author of Universal Church of Kingdom of God in South Africa, A Church of Strangers, also co-author of Nationalism, Politics and Anthropology, A Tale of Two South Africans, and co-editor of Conspicuous Consumption in Africa. She is former editor-in-chief of the journal Anthropology Southern Africa and former director of Institute for Humanities in Africa at UCT. She's currently working her research area in South African lottery and precolonial finance. Today, she's going to be talking to us about gambling pathology from an anthropological perspective. So without further ado, Ilana, I'd like you to take over.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheena, and thank you to the department for inviting me. It's not often that anthropologists get to talk to experts about our work. All right, I'm going to just immediately start off with a presentation to get us talking and give a little bit more time for questions at the end. So on 2 March 2000, President Thabo Mbeki launched the South African Lotto at Yeye Butchery in Langaa, predicting that the National Lottery would raise 13 billion rand for good causes within 5 years. The country thus joined a bevy of other governments that incorporated gambling into the very heart of the fiscus of the state. And a lot of other countries did this after the Second World War. So it's a relatively new, modern movement in the state finance. And like these other countries, the South African government argued that the lottery would allow it a source of soft voluntary funding for projects that its virtually bankrupt fiscus at that stage could not support. So things like the nice to haves that the IMF didn't allow it to have because of its loan arrangements with it. Things like support for its reconstruction and development plan, support for charities, old age homes, children, arts and national heritage, and sports and recreation. In politics speak, the government announced that the resources generated through the lottery would be used to rectify the economic inequalities created by apartheid, channeling money from the upper and middle classes to the poorest of the poor. And this is government speak, so it's not my designation of groups of people, but how they spoke about it. They also described the lottery as a tool for nation building, and I think we've heard this rhetoric many times, and a means for direct personal empowerment. And I think most psychologists here would be a little bit alarmed by those kind of claims, but there we have it. This is politics speak. Now, a number of social welfare organizations, religious bodies, and social workers, and some independent commentators did not share the government's enthusiasm for the lottery. And I think that's not very surprising at all. They feared that the poorest of the poor, and you hear this over and over again, enthused by the economic promises of political liberation and poorly served by our country's education system, would spend large portions of their meager funds on lottery tickets, hoping for a better life and an immediate return of their fortunes. Now, alarmed by the possibility that social grant recipients would blow all their money on lottery tickets, the Department of Social Development threatened that parents who gambled with their social grants would be immediately arrested. In the face of this imminent gambling mania that was supposed to show at any moment, there were even talks in Parliament to suspend the cash payment of social grants and instead give poor people vouchers for food, right, to make sure that they didn't gamble it all away. For their part, poor people were alarmed by the food voucher scheme, and they're also very alarmed by plans to exclude them from the lottery play, because even that little chance would be taken away. So with the help of civil and human rights lawyers, they contested these proposals in court and fought for their right to participate in the National Lottery and to get their grants paid out in cash. Right. Now, even though the Department of Social Development lost the fight in court to protect the poor, their concerns were eventually subsumed or included in the National Lottery Board's duties, specifically the duty to protect lottery players. So in conjunction with the lottery operator at the time, Tingo, the first one, the National Lottery Board set up the Responsible Gambling Committee to promote a culture of responsible gambling, as they called it, mainly targeting the poor. And this is their own phrasing, the poor as a whole homogenous group of people. The committee sponsored various media awareness campaigns, and some of you probably have seen those, to promote a culture of responsible gambling, mainly, as I said, targeting the poor yet again. All right, and research. And so they funded quite a bit of research on problem gambling in relation to the lottery. Now, their task was eventually subsumed under the South African Responsible Gambling Foundation. I've put these logos on here just to sort of help you sort of see the nesting in of all these organizations, but they're not that important. The main point is that there was a lot of interest in this problem of gambling amongst the poor and how dangerous it was and how much money and resources were spent on it. All right. Now, their research division in particular, the National Research Gambling Program, their research division spent a large amount of money funding research in the fields of economics, neuroeconomics, which was a new field, and psychology to understand the nature, causes, and prevalence of problem gambling and to facilitate the development of good public policy. So in general, that, it seems like a very good thing. But what alarmed me about it was specifically in the ways in which they spoke about their work. So in 2011, this group funded by the National Research Development Program wrote an overview of all their work, and they asserted in the main that the lottery produces more problems for players than in more affluent jurisdictions, and that these gambling problems are significantly correlated with other psychological disorders such as substance abuse, depression, and anxiety. Now, what problems the lottery generated for poor players were never clarified in the overview, but the review seemed to counter findings of a large number of other studies, not funded by the gambling boards, that asserted that problem gambling, as you psychologists would classify it, in relation to the lottery was either insignificant or vanishingly small. Very few players of the lottery actually develop compulsive gambling disorder, according to these other studies. But why is it that the funded researchers were so worried about this intersection, this nexus between gambling, poverty, and the lottery? Right. All right. Now, based on long-term ethnographic research, I'm an anthropologist, starting in 2004, among some of South Africa's poorest lottery players and some winners that I interviewed in jail, these people living in Khayelitsha, Langaa, and in Durban's townships of Umlazi and Kwadabega, I hope to unpack some of the base assumptions of the lottery gambling pathology research and to offer an alternative take on poor lottery players and take seriously their social realities and the ontological beliefs that inform lottery play and gambling in this part of the world. So something a little bit different from this obsession with pathology. And for that, I'm going to take you to the National Research Program, NRPG, these guys on the screen, to their gambling education workshops, but only briefly. They're terribly boring, but so very quickly, I'm just going to take you past them. And then I'm going to take you to the lives of these lottery players, people who play the lottery and people who play weekly, sometimes daily, and every once in a blue moon as well, trying to radically alter their fortunes. And if we have a bit of time, also to those who have won the lottery and whose lives were radically changed for very often for the worse. All right. Now, the National Responsible Gambling Programs education program, let's start with that. Oh, there we go. Very interestingly, is largely aimed at poor Black consumers who, by virtue of their extreme poverty, supposedly wager more than they can afford, which makes them, in the words of these researchers, problem gamblers with excessive desires. And or, also in their own words, people who suffer from ignorance and poor life management skills. Okay. Now, not surprisingly, given this framing of what problem gambling constitutes, most of the NRPG's remedies for problem gambling among the poor focus almost exclusively on financial literacy, with particular emphasis on the management of household budgets. Now, this is not the budget that they use. I just pulled it from the internet because there weren't copyright issues with it. So, but this is very much what the NRPG's workshops on problem gambling hand out to participants. And people would have to sit down and work out their household budgets. And they can only, and then they're told that they can only spend discretionary income on things like gambling. All right. Otherwise, you've got a problem. All right. Well, that's basically what the word is. Now, in this exercise, they basically define problem gamblers as people who spend money on gambling that should rightly have gone to essential, predictable household expenses. Now, in essence, these budgeting tools, things like the one that says budget, assume that with a careful, predictable, and measured allocation of a set income, a rational individual can not only extend their exposure to risk, but also extend that protection into the future through savings. Now, these conceptions or these assumptions actually don't map onto the lives of the vast majority of South Africans and specifically African poor people, right? Of the hundreds of even employed people that I interviewed in places like Khayelitsha, Langaa, Kwarebega, and Umlazi, many complained about the fact that most employers nowadays were now working through labor brokers, and that these labor brokers were taking between 20 and 40% of their salaries as their brokering fee. And that's for the duration of your employment. So you can't always predict how much you're going to get, even as a fully employed person. As much of this work was also seasonal or contractual, people did not experience job security even when they received a salary. In this regard, Eric Beera, a colleague in anthropology, found that social workers, both in Cape Town and in Durban, often encourage normally employed people to apply for social grants in order to buffer them from the vagaries of the job market and unexpected life events, which is very common. Many of my interlocutors also regularly had to accommodate and feed family members who came from all over the country to visit them. They were also very vulnerable to disease, to people who fall ill due to HIV/AIDS, COVID recently. So even someone who's normally employed would suddenly have an influx of family members who demand care and large resources, right? And the social safety nets that we see very often in places where the poor are said to live are also quite capricious. So during COVID, for instance, we saw the school feeding schemes suddenly stopping, right? So all of these kind of nets that we assume are normal, regular, and regularize your income are not there. Not surprisingly, I think most poor, or the majority of poor households in South Africa are dependent on government child support grants, old age pensions, and disability grants. But even these grants, or getting access to these grants, was contingent on the complex and highly inefficient bureaucracy of what is called the Department of Horror Affairs. Right? So everyone has a story to tell about this department and its inefficiencies. Of my interviewees who had access to social grants, Many of them complained about erratic payments. They complained about bribes they had to pay the officials to get them in the front of the line before their grant application expires. The mysterious ways in which the computer lost their details, or the ways in which only 1 out of 3 or 4 kids were covered by a child support grant. So even this most stable of incomes is capricious and not something that you can actually bank on. Now, since social grants and even normal incomes were so capricious, the majority of people I spoke to in places where poor people lived had to make a plan, as people call it, making a plan to earn extra income. And this often involved things like having a shisanyama shop, a shop where you can buy meat on the side of the road, sell some fruit and veg, be a hairdresser, gambling. Some people took street gambling as making a plan. So you can work at your gambling skills, be better at it, be more wily than the next guy, and sharpen your skills at it, and therefore work at it. So some people took gambling as a job. All right. But this is, as I said, street gambling. The lottery doesn't count. But again, all of these kind of income streams were unstable, and they were dependent on the capriciousness of all manner of other factors. Eskom. Every time Eskom load sheds, someone with a meat freezer is in trouble. Every time Eskom load sheds, your lights are off, and a thief or two can slip into your spaza shop and help themselves to your goods. Local crime, the bribes that policemen and taxi bosses demand of people who have small businesses. All right. Now, amidst these indeterminacies and insecurities, township residents often explained their economically unwise or risky decisions to loan money to someone they knew was unemployed, or to rent shacks to people who only got child support grants, which are very small for those of you who don't know, and to give orphans credit for groceries as taking a chance. They said, I'm taking a chance. They often explained that their decisions were based not on the immediate economic circumstances of their debtors, as we are all poor, as many of them say, but on the judgments of people's ability to make a plan. So the judgment that someone else would be able to make a plan that would eventually give them some source of income. Acutely aware that other people were like them, dependent on multiple activities and sources of income, my interviewees asserted that they could not know the specifics of everyone's plans. Their debtors might be waiting for a loan repayment from someone else, for a stokvel payout. You know what stokvels are? Rotating credit associations. For funeral insurance to pay out, for a disability grant, for an illness, and so on and so forth. Since people did not have control over the workings of government departments or the bureaucracies that handled funeral and life insurance payments, and since they seldom could demand money from a stokvel out of turn, their plans, these plans that everyone was kind of working were, where am I now? Were not dependent on strict time frames, obviously. As many of my interviewees asserted, you can get all of these things at once. So you can get your grant, your funeral, and your insurance payment all in one day. No one knows. It's all out there. It's all up in the air. All right. So in the meantime, you had to take your chances on a variety of plans, knowing that those plans were equally based on the chances that other people were taking. So everyone is taking a chance all the time. All right. Now, in this larger scheme of things, taking a chance on the lottery was dwarfed by the risks that attended daily life. Defining lottery play then, in this context, as psychologically or economically problematic was laughable to most of my interviewees. And they said, only the middle class would see the lottery as at all risky. Only them would see it in these ways, because we, number one, don't have discretionary incomes or stable incomes for that matter. So splitting your budget in these kind of clear, neat categories seemed, I won't use the word insane, but seems less than rational. And rational is also not a word that you use anymore, so apologies if you're cringing at home. All right. Now, apart from the acceptance that poor people live uncertain economic lives, and that such living happens against a backdrop of a social matrix of indeterminacy, like so everything is up in the air. The Western subject-centered discourse of economics specifically portrays the unexplained gambling and excessive spending behaviors of people, poor people specifically, in terms of a competition of individual desires and wills, making desire the constitutive feature of modern subjectivity. This is the one thing they say that drives gambling, and specifically what they term problem gambling. However, in my research, many people define problem gambling, and there is a rhetoric around what is problematic about gambling and certain forms of gambling that is problematic. It did not include the lottery ever. No one said that the lottery was problematic in any way. But they define problem gambling, other forms of problem gambling, things like dice, you can see dominoes, and so on and so forth, in terms of inappropriate social behavior, often caused by external agents. And these external agents were often invisible. The belief in the material agency of invisible forces, such as witches, demons, jinns, and all manner of other invisible agents, was widespread. And you'll know from the social literature, many books in South Africa have been written about these beliefs. There's just 3 of them, very well-known fact. Now, this belief in these forces out there that can impact on your life negated the possibility of risk-free living, or safe living for that matter, on which much of this economic theory is based. The ideas about pathology is based. My interviewees, for instance, and my interlocutors in all of these places often asserted that even the rich people who have certain jobs and big houses and cars could lose it all in an instance, struck down by the work of invisible forces. So without your knowing, you can step on what they call a witch bomb. So, people would have planted something in the road, you step over it, you get infected by it, and everything in your life will just implode. Car accidents and illnesses, similarly, were seldom ascribed to random occurrences, while violent and unexplained deaths often spurred all kinds of witch hunts, consultations with healers, and exorcisms in various churches. So many of the prosperity and gospel churches have exorcisms to help you get rid of this evil spirit in your life. Right. Now, these invisible forces, I think importantly for psychologists, also said to displace individual agency. Many of my interviewees describe problem gamblers as victims of witchcraft or the overwhelming powers of other players who use strong muti. Muti is an invisible substance that help you on this field in their vicinity. My interviewees seldom concentrated on a gambler's obsessive behavior. They said, this is not important, or his willful actions, and instead often used a particular person's disastrous gambling behavior as a starting point for a long explanation of witchcraft more generally. And I think very importantly, an ontological vulnerability of the person and his family thus affected. Right. To give you one example, I'm going to call the person Irie. He's a bit of a weed smoker. So Irie was a great gossip in Khayelitsha. And he told me this one story of a man we both knew, a local middle-aged man who got caught in a dice game. He wouldn't leave his dice game for love or money. He wouldn't leave to eat or to relieve himself at all for days on end. So he would be stuck on the corner of the road playing the dice. Now, the poor man's wife and children had to constantly carry food backwards and forwards to the spot where the men played, and his son had to empty the glass bottles in which he relieved himself. Right? So we're talking about something that would concern many of you. All right. Now, apart from this hardship, the family, said Irie, was also plagued by unexplained illnesses and deaths, while the man's one successful spaza shop was virtually bankrupt within a week for no reason. No reason, he said. There's absolutely no reason. Just suddenly the whole thing just imploded. Some township residents who joined the conversation then said, they also saw strange lights outside of the accursed family's shack. The man's gambling then was caused by the same witchcraft that destroyed the rest of the family. And Irie mused, it would probably consume the man totally. Right. Being in the vicinity of someone who used strong muti was equally dangerous. The dice players specifically I spoke to often admitted that they would only join a game once they've had convinced themselves that their potential fellow players weren't using muti. So they were looking out for signs that someone was either speaking too loudly, because if you do and you have something in your mouth, you can spit it at someone, or playing with their pockets, because there would be an amulet in there or some kind of dangerous stuff. All right. The problem, as many of my interviewees complained, was that people who used strong muti were also invincible and often undetectable, because you use muti also to make your use of muti undetectable, right? So there were layers and layers of ways in which people imagined the working of this invisible world. Thus, it was only once you were caught in a game, like dice, that you realized that someone else had very strong dice, as people call it, or were using muti. And there are many, many stories circulating in these places of people who were zombified by the dice, zombified by the gamble, got caught there and could never, ever leave, driven to bankruptcy and all the horrible social ills that come with such an appetite. Let's call it an appetite. All right. Now, some of my interviewees, especially the ones, especially the ones who attended prosperity gospel churches, like the one I did my first book on, also described how demons force people to do this kind of work. So we're not talking about a distinction between Christians and people who are not Christians. One of my lottery winners was a Muslim man who spoke about jinns who, number one, helped him to win the lottery and then helped him to lose all of it, right? So we're talking about a whole gamut of beliefs in South Africa across many kind of, I don't say religious beliefs, because the belief in evil spirits is not necessarily a belief or religion in the same way, but many South Africans have this external, extra reality that's really an enormous part of their daily lives, right? In this view of the world, bewitched, possessed gamblers were locally often defined not by the depth of their desires. So the guy that Irie was gossiping about, wasn't about the depth of this guy's desire, but by his bodily permeability. The fact that his body was open enough to allow these demons or the muti or whatever force you choose to ascribe this to get into your body and take over control. Right. Now, it's in this context, in this larger context of economic and ontological uncertainties, that poor township residents participate in the lottery, right? And as I already said, they don't see the lottery play as potentially addictive or problematic at all. And it's precisely because they took a chance on the lottery in the same way they took a chance on everyday streams of possible income. And the chances they took on the lottery was extremely small. Most lottery winners and most research on the lottery in South Africa says exactly the same thing. Most poor people play maybe a line or two at most. So it is not an irrational hope. They don't miscalculate their chances by spending all their money. Most people spend a line or two. And that's very small in the larger scheme of ways in which they invest, as I said, in bad loans and all kinds of debt that they get involved in, circles of debt. All right. And they did so even when they used muti. So there's often the idea that muti is a very instrumental and irrational way in which people kind of try to protect themselves and work at these invisible forces. So even if they do use muti, people only still play with one line or two lines, which is an interesting thing. Right. And as you know, the lottery muti, there's a massive market of all kinds of lotions, potions, rings, you name it, soaps, powders, sticks, small men, you name it, that people can buy to help them to win the lottery. So people would spend, in one case, I have a guy who spent 800 Rand on the muti and only 2.50 Rand on the actual lottery. on his play, right? To give you a sense of where the investment is, all right? Now, although most of these remedies and consultations were dependent on a concentrated willingness to believe that they will work. So the moment you start thinking that your lotion, your potion, your ring stopped working, it will stop working. So you have to concentrate on its effectiveness the whole time for it to be effective. That's the belief, right? People were acutely aware that many of the diviners and the healers that gave this stuff, sold this stuff, were also taking a chance and trying a business, right? So there was a deep suspicion about these guys as well, right? So there's this constant ways in which people suspect that others are also taking a chance. It might not work. So it's not a belief in the sense that they are investing in a sure thing at all. They laughingly remark very often that most of these healers and diviners and people selling you entry to the lottery were themselves living in shacks and were not rich, right? So there's this deep awareness that this is actually not a solution. All right. I think I'm going to almost stop, so I'm just going to conclude here. All right. So observers and academics have been hard-pressed to explain poor people's seemingly irrational participation in the South African lottery. Given the odds against winning, and they're enormous, and the extreme poverty of many players, many observers have suggested that poor people should not play the lottery at all, or gamble for that matter. An influential body of literature even suggests that poor lottery players suffer from a range of psychological pathologies for taking a chance. Right? They shouldn't be doing this. This is absolutely irrational. As I hope to show in this presentation, that body of work takes the middle-class economic experience of risk as a human universal. Right? That's the measuring stick. And based on that, they classify other people's engagement with risk in terms of pathology. So they don't take into account that just being alive in a place where almost everything is up in the air does not make you pathological for taking a small risk on something like the lottery. The pathology literature also assumes a very particular conception of the Western self and its motivations as a human universal. This contained self that is driven by desire. A self that stands in a very particular relationship then to will as well. Right? Now, this conception does not allow for an ontological situatedness in the world that takes seriously the possibility of the existence and agency of invisible forces and a self open to such work. So what do we do when your whole body, your whole life is open to these external forces that you have almost no control over? How do we then look at pathology? So where does this leave us in terms of gambling and pathology? I'm obviously not saying that psychologists or neuroeconomists, as they're called, should discard with the DSM-5 or attempts to help those with extreme gambling behavior problems. But I do want to introduce just a small caution that when such diagnoses seem to take on a moral prescriptive role when it comes to the consumption patterns of the poor. And I think this is what often happens with the lottery and with conceptions of poor lottery players who are pathological and need help. I'm going to stop at that point, I think, to open for some questions and see if there are any.
Thank you so much for that, Ilana. Very interesting to think of it, like you say, from an anthropological perspective and not just looking at gambling as a psychological pathology. And I think it's very interesting to see people's just lay beliefs around gambling. And it makes me actually wonder about, people who do present to us with what we would define in DSM as, gambling pathology, whether they actually hold some of these beliefs and how open they would be to talk about them and, confess to them, or whether it's sub-held kind of beliefs. So very interesting from that perspective, but I see some hands up.
Sure.
Okay, so Leslie.
Hi, Ilana. Thank you, sir. Can you hear me?
I can, Leslie, yeah.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much. That was a really wonderful talk, a model of clarity and conciseness. So thank you. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And thank you for coming to talk to our department. This is more of a sort of comment than a question to you, but I think the way in which you've helped us think about something that we often pathologize as an individual pathology, the desire to gamble, the gambling addiction, and so on. I mean, this is something which really bedevils our discipline in psychology, and I'm reminded of many of us in South Africa, for very obvious reasons, are interested in trauma and traumatic histories and so on. And once again, our diagnostic system conceives of trauma as something unusual that happens while you sort of lead your sort of very ordinary life, and then in the history of the concept of post-traumatic stress disorders, then you go to Vietnam, and then you get traumatized and something, or then you get raped, and in fact, people's lives are suffused with instances and examples of what more privileged people like you and me would regard as traumatic. So there's something, I think, really important for the discipline of psychology and for the study of psychopathology in what you're telling us about, it's often called precarity, but unpredictability, and then what happens to belief systems, and how the whole world is, as one person put it, cognitively unpredictable, but then when people react to that in unpredictable, or what appear to be unpredictable ways, we see it as a pathology. I just think your analysis is really useful for us beyond even thinking about gambling. So thanks very much, Ilana.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, as I said, I'm not trying to say a psychologist should stop. I'm just asking, just broadening, what is universal and what is human? And I think that's the work that anthropologists usually do, or should do. So, but what is universal? And based on that universality, then, what is pathological, and how do we deal with it? And I think, Sheena, your earlier question, how do we ask that question? Because all research in South Africa has shown that at least 85% of South Africans believe in the work of invisible agents, whichever way you define it. And we can just talk about regular religion. Regular religion, I'm talking mainstream, defined by the government kind of religions. So 85% of South Africans at least believe in the work and material work of these spirits. These spirits can impact on your life. So what do we do then when we treat people, as you say, who present with trauma? How do we talk about gods and spirits and witches and these forces without dismissing their experience? Because I think there's harm in that, to say, your belief in a god, a spirit, a bad influence, a jinn, whatever you want to call it, is in another way pathological. So not only is your experience not validated, but your actual whole worldview is invalidated by me telling you that there's yet another thing wrong with you. Yeah. So it's an invitation to maybe open up those questions. And I think, Leslie, you did in your own work, the work on disability. And I think I recall very clearly a presentation you did at HUMA many years ago on the fact that many South African psychologists don't speak a local language, and yet treat people. And I think you called it behavioral psychology, looking at people and somehow making a diagnosis. So this, the core, and there is social psychology that does some of that work, and even, I don't know, do we call it normal psychology? I'm not sure. I don't want to use those words, but I'm at a loss for the right words to use. But precisely that, and opening up for these possibilities, and what it means then for the dignity of our patients, of the people that present with lives that are very different from where we come from. And I think it's very clear in the work that I analyze where they come from is a middle class, very specific Western positionality, and that's what they use to determine who's got problems, who doesn't. And I think, worryingly for me, where research money goes, very selfishly. Where does the research money go? And we're talking about millions and millions spent on neuroimaging of poor people to find the source of their pathology. And then all this money spent on budgeting, which, to be quite frank, people laugh at, because it's the same tool that people use for HIV programs. It's the same, so if you back in the day, if you these NGOs came around with, the HIV literature and whatever else, you also had to budget. Now, whether you have a gambling problem or you have HIV or any matter of things that can be wrong with you, the first thing you get taught in most of these workshops is to budget. And there's a normative middle class sensibility at work here that I think we need to unpack a little bit and problematize. So a small intervention there. Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Sheena.
Okay, do we have anyone else from the chat? So I'm just looking at Prof Kruger's comments in the chat. She says, your talk is so important. I think it is so relevant, for instance, to teenage pregnancy. Teenage mothers are pathologized, but in my research, it's clear that becoming pregnant, not falling pregnant, is often an action of hope, the normative middle class sensibility.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lou Marie. It's wonderful talking to psychologists. You're also affirming. You're going to be my audience from now onwards. But absolutely, Lou Marie, and in my own work with young women, it was often an achievement to fall pregnant, to fulfill a motherly role, and something that was celebrated by women themselves and by their mothers. And it was an achievement for many of these young women who had very little. Other achievements, as they called it, to fall pregnant, to fall lucky, as one of my interlocutors also called it. So definitely, thank you for that. Megan?
All right. So I have just one more question. If we don't have any more from the chat, I'm just going to check. You've got a substantive body of work that you've done in this area. It just makes me curious as to what instigated this interest and this passion for this area of research. What led you on this journey?
It's a long answer and an anthropological answer. But I did my first research on the border of South Africa and Mozambique in a little craft market, where one day the women around me started talking about this new church that opened up in Durban, where you can go in and you can choose your blessings from the wall. And there were pictures on the wall of BMWs, double-story homes, whatever your heart desired. Problem was, you had to get to Durban, which was 5 hours away, but they heard there were also a cost involved. And the cost wasn't monetary, but it had some dark involvement with invisible forces. So there were talks that the pastors in this church were witches, and they got this stuff by flying at night and all kinds of things. But some women then mused that actually, the risk was okay. Some of them might take the risk for all this riches. And I thought, I need to find this church. And I went to this church interested in this idea of changing your fortunes overnight, and that people imagine that as a real possibility in the world. And as I walked in, the church was busy blessing lottery tickets to help the balls. So there was a confluence of this prosperity gospel and ideas about the South African lottery. And this was at the time when the court case was happening, where these poor South Africans were fighting for their right to actually play the lottery, because there were real moves to exclude them from the lottery because they wouldn't know any better. These people, as they often called, didn't have the new to manage their money, and because they also have a poor education, they're going to spend it all wildly because they can't work out the risk, their chances of winning, and so on and so forth. So they're just going to do what many or much of the literature talks about, the fallacy, the gambling fallacy of, investing more and more, hoping you're going to chase your losses, And actually, all research showed that almost no one does that, except for the very rich, interestingly enough. It's only the very rich who spend thousands on the lottery in one go. So they suffer from the gambling fallacy, but not the very poor. Very poor would buy 1 or 2 lines and would spend money on the muti. And that investment then, as I said, is an investment that is infused with suspicion as well. It's not a sure thing either. But, and I think this is important, that investment is an investment in your body and making it less permeable to a world that would infect and affect other things as well, because the lottery is not one thing. Your body is connected to the lottery, to your health and wealth, and to your family. So that investment is not a tool for the lottery alone, but to close off your body. And I think that, that also needs to be taken into account, how these instruments work. For people online, there is a massive protest action outside, and I just learned before the talk about the horrific incident in one of our university colleges, reses. And I see our students are politically engaged in that, which is fantastic. So if there's a bit of disturbance in the background, it is for that reason. There's a hand up.
Yes, I see.
Len, it's you.
Hi, Ilana. It's so nice to see you in a different setting.
Yes. Free range, yeah. It's lovely to be free range for a change.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I only joined later on, so I didn't get all of your presentation. But I think I just want to echo a lot of what you say, but just also say that this is an extremely important topic in theological research as well. For those of you who do not know me, I'm the Director of Research in the Faculty of Theology. And we have a lot of students, postgraduate students, working on the topic of what we call the prosperity gospel. That whole thing of being blessed, or, if your faith is just strong enough, you can actually do anything, or some blessings are mediated by prophets or pastors or whatever. We all know of the prophet of doom who wanted to cure a congregant by spraying doom on him, for instance. But I mean, this is a serious challenge to the church. In Africa, it's very rampant, especially in Pentecostal and charismatic churches, and it's good for me to hear that this challenge, or just investigating this phenomena, is also being done by psychologists and by anthropologists, and not only from a dogmatic or theological perspective. So thank you very much for that. And I'm just doing a bit of advertising. If anyone is doing research on this and they would like to know about the theological discourse on these issues, they are welcome to contact me, and I will put them into contact with people who are working on this from a theological perspective. Thank you so much.
Fabulous. Thanks, Lynn. Absolutely, yeah. As I said, my first introduction to this stuff was in a prosperity gospel church in Durban, and this intersection between luck, money, gods, spirits, and pathology was there, and yeah. Oh, title of the next book is actually on the lottery.
Wow, it could be that. Luck, money, gods, and pathology.
I don't know about the pathology bit. I think I've said my piece about pathology. But it is, in the book that I'm busy writing, I look at a couple of lottery winners who ended up in jail after winning, whose lives were turned upside down by having won. And they explain that both the turn of their fortunes in the first instance, in terms of the help of gods and spirits and so on and so forth, but also the overturning of their fortunes in the same ways. And how do we make sense of that? Because One of the ways in which the lottery works is it forces winners to go through these long sessions where they are prepared for the life that has changed. And the preparation is all about money, how to budget. Again, there's one tool. So if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So, again, how to budget, how to work it out. And actually, across the world, this tool doesn't work. Most lottery winners, doesn't matter how much they win, hold on to their money for a maximum of 3 years, especially if you are poor or lower middle class. So this tool doesn't work. So something is broken in the way in which we imagine money and pathology's difficulties. There's another one, Lagrange. Lagrange, thank you.
I wanted to know, are there any common themes for these people that did end up in jail? Any common sort of pitfalls that they all spent their money on the same thing, or how did they all end up in the same situation?
Good question. Definitely. Common theme, social relationships that broke down. Very often, it's very hard if you live in a poor neighborhood to hide money. As I said, everyone's taking a chance on everyone else all the time, borrowing and lending money. So you have to keep your eyes pretty open to spot when any kind of money comes into a home, right? Into your neighbor's home or whatever else, so you can be first in line to claim back your money. So in that context, where everyone's watching everyone all the time because everyone's making a plan and taking a chance, it's very hard to hide any amount of winnings. So when you do win, people are often quickly at your door. And what starts happening is your family, colleagues, lovers, friends want to have some kind of monetized value to the relationship you have with them, and are always disappointed at the money that they do get. So it often leads to breakdown of family relationships, intimate relationships, other intimate relationships, and that then pushes these lone lottery winners to friends who are more interested in their money than in anything else. And before you know it, many of them turn to one specific one, for instance, turned to gangs to hold on to his money, because he started realizing that he was spending it all on everything that came around. Like, he bought sound systems for his clapped out car. 250,000 Rand he spent on a sound system for an old Ford Escort that was worth 10,000 Rand because he wanted great sound and he was a hot guy. But then the car broke down and he forgot about the sound system in it, and when he got back to the car, it was all stolen. So it was sort of, kind of impulsive buying. And what's fascinating is that almost every single one of these lottery players that I interview have very clear plans of what to do with the money. Buy a house, invest the rest, live off the interest. Every single person, no matter how poor they were, had this plan. But the moment they won the money, those plans went out of the window, despite all the training and everything else, and they were just caught up in the moment. And that moment kept on spinning faster and faster, and before you know it, they had no friends, and they were nowhere, and in great difficulties, in great trouble. And most of them were much worse off after having won the lottery than before. So it's probably one of the worst things that can happen to you, unless, and this is what's interesting, unless you're middle class or rich, because your money can be hidden. And I've interviewed an architect, I won't out the person, who had won the lottery and had bought their dream house, built and bought their dream house. And I asked, so, did your family know? And he said, no, because if you are middle class or rich, no one asks you where your money comes from. That would be vulgar, right? Everyone just assumes that you're on the same treadmill and you got a mortgage, which is impossible when you're poor to do. And he could hide a massive win in that way. People just assumed he had more debt. That's it. Whereas that is impossible. So definitely a common theme, if you're poorer, is this theme of people watching, demanding, and this total breakdown of family relationships, and usually quite a precipitous downfall for most of them. Yeah. Any other questions? Done.
I think that's all the questions. Thank you so much, Ilana. That was
Thank
so
you.
and so pleasant to have it in person. But thank you so much for those who joined online as well.
Thank you.
And then, yeah, you'll find our talk uploaded on our YouTube channel for those who missed the beginning. I heard someone missed the beginning. So thank you so much, Ilana.
Thank you to all of you, and thank you for wonderful questions and a very affirming environment. Thank you. Do I leave?
Yes.
Sorry, I just put the leave one instead of throwing. There we go.